Okay. I think we are launched.
So excited.
Yes.
Yeah, fun.
We'll see. We'll give people like a few minutes just to get
Let some people
attached. The participant count is climbing as we speak.
I'm gonna get it. Oh, I see. There are now 105 people here.
Oh yeah, 117.
Hi,
I'm very
everyone.
excited. They just post. Yay. We're excited too.
We are waiting for more people to come in. So imagine that we're all physically together in a gorgeous theater space somewhere, and the audience is filtering in their gowns, or not their gowns, because, right?
Disha says hello to everyone. Yay. Hi, Disha.
Hi, Disha. I love Disha. Everybody check out Disha Filial's book coming out in the fall, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. Everybody wants to know about the secret lives of church ladies, right? I do.
And how?
I would be a successful church lady with a secret life. I would be able to, I would have great secrets to keep. I would. All right.
All right, so it looks like maybe we've stabilized, so I'll go ahead and do a quick introduction and then let you guys do your thing.
All right.
So hi to everyone, I'm Alison Saar, and along with my gallery, Concept Art Gallery, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this dialogue among two incredible, powerful women, Alison Saar and Vanessa German. When Vanessa first approached me about hosting an artist-artist dialogue and mentioned that she wanted to talk to Alison Saar, I think it took approximately a millisecond for me to respond with a very excited yes. I have admired Alison's work from afar for many years, and I'm just so pleased to have this brief virtual interaction thanks to the gods of internet and Zoom. And Alison Saar, as I'm sure most of you know, is a fantastic West Coast-based artist who hails from a family of wonderful artists. Her work is by and large figurative and speaks to the power of the Black human form, and specifically powerful Black women. She works mostly in a sculptural vein, but also produces some of the most wonderful prints, often wood cuts or lino cuts, which are just fantastic. And I think she actually just posted about a benefit print through her gallery, LA Louvre, last night on Instagram. So might be worth going to check that out, get a copy. And of course, I'm thrilled to introduce my dear friend and my co-conspirator in all things rainbow, Vanessa German. Vanessa defines herself as a citizen artist, which was actually the title of the first show we exhibited here at Concept. And her artistic pursuits seem to know no bounds. She's a sculptor, a painter, a spoken word artist, a neighborhood activist, and a poet. And she also has a really wonderful garden here in Pittsburgh, which she sometimes gives a little tour on social media, and which are really fun to watch. So I highly recommend that. Both Alison and Vanessa have won more awards and had more single artist museum exhibitions than I have time to list here. But suffice it to say that today we are in the presence of brilliance. So you're welcome to type in questions into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to field them sort of throughout and at the end. But that said, I'm just delighted to welcome both Alison and Vanessa into this virtual space for an artist and artist dialogue. So hello to you both.
Great. Hi. Hello.
Hi, and it's so good to be here. It's so good to see you, Alison.
I know it's been a while. When was that? Last fall we got to see each other in person to see your show, which was really beautiful in New York. So
it was so special to have you see that show. That show meant a lot to me, and it was really hard. It was very difficult to pull the whole process together because I moved part of my studio from Pittsburgh to the Bronx, and I worked really hard in the Bronx for about 6 weeks, 5.5, 6 weeks.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the last time we went to Pastis
Right, you're gonna hang out.
and looked through the show, and uh, and we talked about me. We actually talked about going to Disneyland. Do you remember
Oh
that?
gosh, that's right, because you would come through LA and went to Disney.
Right. 'Cause I have those 3 free passes to Disneyland, and we were talking about going, and I thought about that, and I was like, man, I don't know when we're gonna be able to go to Disneyland now.
Disneyland. Oh gosh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Disneyland has its issues, but definitely, I don't know. It's worth checking out for sure.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens there. But let's talk about how we know each other's work. Is that a cool place to start?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I think I told you this. So we met. I met you in person for the first time in LA when I think it was last summer, but I got the best gift in the world one day when I got this email from you, or I got an email from the gallery that I had a show at in Los Angeles at Gab Black, and it said, it's like, Alison Saar left you a note. I think that I took a picture of the email and sent it to Allison Ayler, and I was like, oh my God, Alison Saar left me a note at the gallery. And I was like, I didn't even read the note. Just the fact that there was a note there for me from you was really special. And you were so generous. She said something like, let's meet or let's talk the next time you're in LA. And, but so you saw that show, and then I walked you through the show at Fort Gansevoort. But and I think I might have told you this earlier or sometime when we talked, but looking at your work as a young Black woman who was feeling their way through a process of really bringing myself into understanding and recognition of the sort of frequency of power, the frequency of form, the frequency of making that really resonated with me. I studied your work, and I studied your work through feeling. I studied your work through human technology. I studied your work by following the sort of markers of my heart and my soul. And I would look at your figures, and I would look at the weight of your work. And there would be times, and the way that I took that study upon myself was, there were times that I would just be up at 2:00 in the morning on the internet, looking at all of these different images and asking myself what it was in the images and what it was in the form, what it was in the poetry of the way that you held the Black woman's body and the Black woman's form that touched me dimensionally. It touched me in a way that, looking at those bodies, looking at, and I'm not sure which body of work it is where there's one form that has a whole stack of pots and pans.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Right.
and that's something for me, that's something that I had started to do in my own work, just like going around the neighborhood and like picking up things and working with dolls, because I didn't have any money. I was squatting in a house, and I would put these dolls back together, and I started stacking things on their heads. And really what I was trying to do was I was trying to create this sensation that I got in my soul, and I was trying to make it physical. And then I discovered that in your work, and I was like, I wonder what this feels like for this artist. I wonder if she's working in this sort of dimensional frequency of recognizing what it means to place this Black form in the public, to be a Black woman doing this, but also like, how does this speak to her soul? Because it really speaks to my soul, and it feels like a natural language. Like, that's what I would say when I look at your work and when I experience your work, that it feels like I'm experiencing a language that is telepathic, a language that is ancient and brand new simultaneously, that speaks to me outside of the symbol language that we have. And I feel like your work cared for me in that way, that I had this experience of care and coming to understand an experience with my own self and with my own heart and body in a world that we're in a world where I didn't necessarily get a lot of reflection of my wholeness or affirmation in my strangeness or affirmation in that. I feel like I got that from your work. I feel like when I look at your work, it understands me back.
Well,
That's a lot, isn't it, Allison? Look at me. I have to hold my heart while I say it, but I definitely, I have that, I do have that experience, yes, with your work.
well, first off, thank you. But, I think it's interesting as an artist, especially, I think you're more, I love that, you're kind of have this sort of, position as citizen artist, because I think you are much more sort of open and have the world in your studio and have more communication with, your surroundings than I do. I tend to be very isolated and work very much in my little hole sort of thing. But, I think it's, so in that way, it's always really amazing to me to hear someone like yourself say that you grew up seeing my work and seeing this out there, because, I always kind of think it exists in shows and then it kind of goes away. And a lot of times when they're in museums, they never see the light of day, right? A lot of our works, are basement dwellers. They may be in great collections, but they rarely see the light of day. But, so I would...
People understand that sometimes either. I don't think that a lot of the public recognizes how much work never sees the light of day. Yeah. Right. And then if there's so few Black women in a collection, then what that means if that work is not seeing the light of day.
Right. Or they periodically rotate the same 5 pieces. So
yeah.
But I would say that the first time I'm embarrassed to say I'm really late coming to your work, girl, because I don't know, maybe because I live in my little hole in my home. But I think actually I was when I posted that we were going to have our conversation, someone posted back and said, I told you about her work like a long time ago. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay. And I didn't really, see the work in person until Jeffrey Deitch's show, People.
Yeah.
And, I went there kind of like, oh, I don't know what's going on. And then I saw it, was like, oh my God. And I gravitated towards them right away. And then, I'm really like, I never go up to the desk to talk to people or anything. And so I went up there and I said, I've got to talk to you about, Vanessa German and who is she and blah, blah, blah. And they said, oh, well, she's got her show just down the block, because I wouldn't even have known about your show at Gavlik. So, so they pointed me and we literally walked to the show, and it was just so great to see the work. And I'm just like, okay. And that's something also I never do, is leave notes for artists, but I just had to do that, because I said, we need to know each other. And you weren't in town at the time. And then you did come to town you did your performance, your Long Kiss performance, in which I don't know if I was doing a talk. I had something that for some reason I absolutely could not be there. Otherwise I would have been there. But then we were able to meet up and have pastries in Los Angeles together, and you were on your way going up. But it was just so great to see work that you kind of immediately connect to, you immediately feel a kinship with. And I think, when you're talking about, your gathering of dolls and stuff, and we probably, next time you come, I have to take you to some of my good junk haunts, right? But
oh my gosh, yes. I can't.
But this, and it's interesting when you're talking about Cool Mama, which is the figure with all the plates and dishes stacked upon her head, and this idea of kind of, and I think that comes, in my work periodically, this. And what I saw in your work too was this sort of, balancing of things and these balancing of burdens on your head. And
yeah.
I'd gotten some weird criticism once. It's just like, because it was a woman who was balancing basins and like wrap things of, cloth wrap bundles on her head. And she was just saying, oh, that's just so demeaning, where, why was the Black woman always being shown working? It's like, well, because that's what most of us do, one. And, she's like, why can't, we push beyond these kind of images of being workers and stuff like that? And I'm just saying, I'm trying to, I was like, whose shoulders are you standing on? Like, how did you get to be, I guess she was, this is in Sacramento, how did you get to be in this position that, someone had to do a lot to get you to school, and someone had to work their butts off to get you where you are. And so that's kind of interesting. But I, love this idea that, these, and especially your figures, which look like children, are very small and, again, kind of like shouldering the burden, right? And handling it all, which is,
Yeah. There's something about that, that comment, like, why do we have to always show Black women in this position? And I, one of the things that mostly Black people have said to me that I get as a criticism in some of my work is, why is my work so Black? Why are they so Black? Because they're covered in tar. Right. And I'm small now, and I work life size and a little bit larger than life size now. And I feel like I had this reckoning in my work when I was sort of, I had this period of time where I had very, very little money, and I would just go through the abandoned houses, and I would go through vacant lots. And I would see, there was one house on my street that the porch had collapsed. And so the inside of the house, and you couldn't easily get into this abandoned house, but you could see I worked my way into this house, and the house looked like it was frozen in time, and it had this dining room cabinet, and it was filled with all these dishes, and there was still like old coffee containers and sugar tins in the kitchen, and it was this frozen moment, and you could see how much care this woman put in to making this home the perfect ecosystem that she could make for her body and for her prayers and for her dreams. And I thought a lot about how I came into reckoning with what it cost the women who came before me to stay alive in this world. And I thought about how my grandmother who became a nurse eventually, but she was born in Louisiana. Her father was a sharecropper, and she was a domestic. And at one point she told me, I said, Grandma, what did you do? She said, I was a domestic. And I said, what does that mean? Because I wasn't used to a woman calling themselves a domestic. I was used to housekeeper. I was used to nanny.
Right,
and
yeah.
Domestic is, a section of the store in Kmart where it says like domestic, and you can find ironing boards, and you can find iron. So my grandmother explained to me what that day was like for her, that she would leave her children very early in the morning, and she would go and she would basically mother someone else's entire household. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, how did she do that? And what did that feel like? What did it feel like to iron another man's shirts? Mm-hmm. So he go to work fresh pressed, and what did the iron mean to her? And did she sing while she was ironing? Was she praying with her hand on that iron? And so I had this time of reckoning where, in my 20s, I just went around looking for the objects that my grandmother would have touched, because I wanted that information from them. And I needed to have time with that. I needed to recognize that connection and that line between us. And I think that there is space in this world for all of the images that we want to make of ourselves and our mothers and our sisters. And there is space enough and listening enough in the world that we have to hear our stories and to hear the reasons why with that. And something that really sometimes frustrates me in the art world is when somebody says, oh, that's over. Like, remember post-Black? Remember for a while, Alison?
Yeah, I remember around like, post what?
There was like this whole joy over being post-Black, over like, finally now,
we don't have to, right.
We can just paint a red painting or, you know, finally now. And I just remember, and so now, like, what is it to reflect on that period of post-Blackness now, right
Right.
now?
Yeah.
But just the
But
idea to control people's ideas, or control that it needs to be controlled, that what we create needs to be controlled. I'm not with it. I'm not hearing it.
well, I mean, there's also a lot of people out there telling other stories as well. And I just, you know, you got to tell this stuff and talk to the stuff that's really true to who you are and what you really feel passionate about, you know. And I just feel like, you know, that these are stories that, one, were not told, and that these are stories that still need to be told. This is still happening. There are still folks taking care of other people's babies while their babies are being taken care of by somebody else, you know, or not at all. You know, they're just sitting at home locked up, sort of thing. So, you know, I think that these are all still really prevalent and pressing issues. And I think that's also interesting in terms of, you know, the skin being too dark. I get that a lot, of course, because I'm, you know, look white, because I am half white, but you know, and I know, you know, that's been a criticism of, you know, Carrie James Marshall and all sorts of folks. And it's just kind of like, you know, this is, you know, this is kind of what we're doing. And this is, I don't know, this is really crucial to us. So, and I think, you know, and, you know, I even get the thing, well, why don't you make, you know, art about your white half? And just like, well, one, I didn't really know that much about my white half. We were a little bit alienated from some of my father's family due to racism, because they didn't want to hang out with, you know, mixed race cousins. but you know, really it's the, you know, and I think also because my mother was such a powerhouse, that those things were always at the forefront, and the civil rights movement was always at the forefront, you know, whether at my mom, you know, at home with my mother's work, or going to my grandmother's, who had, you know, Lorraine's Hansberry's The Movement was her coffee book table, you know, her coffee table book sort of thing. You know, that was just what was really important in our family. I have to ask you, where in Louisiana was your grandmother from?
Mer Rouge,
Where?
outside Rouge,
Outside Baton Rouge.
Mer Rouge. And my grandmother tells this story about how she would follow her father through a field, over a bywater fence, over a railroad track,
Mm-hmm.
under something else, to a cornfield, to a church that they built by hand. This church,
Wow.
and so my grandmother is 94 now, and so her memory, like, she repeats a lot of stories, and it's really powerful to hear these early memories that she has, where she, you know, she talks about literally the size of her father's feet, these big shoes, following these big shoes through
Wow.
the field. And you know, my grandfather was a sharecropper. He picked cotton. My father picked cotton as a
Wow.
little boy. My father was picking cotton by the time he was like 6 years old, and he told me, he said, cotton is really light. It takes a long time to pick enough cotton to make that pound weight, you know, to do. And my mother was born in Louisiana also, and my mother was very light skinned. My mother, people used to think that, like, when we were teenagers and we were doing like lawn work on the weekend, we were working in the yard, people used to drive by when we lived in Ohio, and they would ask my mother if they could hire us.
I thought you were rented out. Wow.
True, because they always thought that my mother was white, and people used to ask my mom why she didn't pass it.
Yeah.
And it was never an option for her. So how have you contended with that, with people who talk about your skin color, and like any kind, did you ever have to deal with that? People like addressing or asking you to address if you feeling like you had the right to talk about certain things, or not talk about certain things, or not make certain work because of the color of your skin? And how did you continue? Do you have a story you can share around that, or feel comfortable around it, or a reckoning that you have with it?
You know, probably a few actually, but you know, I think, yeah, that's always kind of coming up, and sometimes people can't even make that leap. I remember I did a whole talk.
Still comes up?
Yeah, on occasion, yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's been criticism. I remember some critic in Washington D.C. Had a show at the Hirshhorn, and they said, "Oh, yeah, well, she's more beige than black." I'm like, okay, but what does that serve us? I mean, what does that say about anything? And I remember doing a whole lecture, and when you're open it up for questions, we better not get this question today. But someone said, "Why do you make art about black people?" And I'm like, well, if you were listening. But and I think there is that option to kind of, and I do some work about being kind of in this weird sort of space between two worlds in a certain way, and that I am definitely privileged to hearing stuff and witnessing stuff a lot like what I kind of wish I was as smart as Adrian Piper to have those little cards she handed out saying you just kind of, because I remember this was in college too, it was some party of artists and they were going on and they told some Rufus and Remus joke or something like that, and then they started telling another joke and they all paused and looked at me and said, "Oh, are you Jewish?" Because it was going to be a Jewish joke. And I said, "Oh no, I'm black. You already covered me. You already got," and that kind of like killed the party. They all like time to go sort of thing. But, so I think, there's always that kind of opportunity basically to kind of see the other side of, the other, what's behind that mask that so many people put on. But at the same time, I have to recognize that because I am perceived as white, that I, of course, have privileges to things. I have privileges to kind of like all of that nasty stuff out there that they're not going to kind of feel like they have to, hold back or conceal that. But I'm also, privileged in that I'm able to go and do things and not be, not feel threatened because, people don't feel threatened because they think I'm black or I'm going to be dangerous to them or something like that. So, so it's kind of this weird sort of space to be in. But for me, again, kind of, growing up the way I did. And I have to also say that on top of looking like I'm white, I grew up in Laurel Canyon, which was predominantly white as well. So, I didn't have that experience of being, I guess I was born down in West Adams and things like that, but, I don't really remember much of that. But, aside from going to visit my grandma and them and my cousins, which was always this kind of great world where I felt really comfortable. And then always back in school feeling kind of like this weird sort of other, that I didn't really belong either place sort of thing. So.
Yeah. Has isolation been a part of your life?
I think so, but I think a lot of that is just because it's my personality. I think I really love being alone. I'm really comfortable being alone. I mean, I think it, with all the tragic that has kind of forced this sort of self-isolation, I think for myself, it's just been something that, is second nature to me anyhow, because that's pretty much how I spend most of my time anyhow. But yeah, and I also recognize the privilege in that as well, to be able to be comfortable and have a home to live in and to have enough space to have a garden sort of thing. There's a lot of privilege.
Yeah, I feel that too. I fought for a long time the fact and the feeling that I'm really comfortable alone, and that that the isolation is good for me. And for a while I felt I sort of had suffering around it, like, why aren't there more people around me? Why don't I fit in these different places? And as my practice has grown, and as I have really been able to sink into the experience of my own process of what happens to me when I'm in the studio, when I'm with the material, as I have sunk into that, then it has pried away any anxiety about like fitting in certain places or doing things, and anxiety about that isolation. And I'm one of 5 kids, and so I wasn't isolated in the house when we were growing up. But even as a little kid, I can remember times when I would just take paper to a corner someplace and
go hide away.
And I really felt like I could tap into another world if I just had a pencil and a piece of paper. I felt like anything was possible. And
Right.
I could feel myself in that space in a way that, you know, there are these little awakenings throughout my life where I realized now that I wasn't isolated. Sometimes I was just protected from things, and that I made it. Like I think I really feel like I needed to make it through certain things and be safe, and I made it through there. Yeah,
Mm.
and, and I recognize, like, I feel I when I'm alone in my space, the fact that I have a space, the fact that I'm not working in a basement anymore, that there's not mold all around me, the fact that I have actual power tools now. Listen,
Are they
like,
the
listen, like I went through times you should have seen. I wish that the great documentary filmmaker in the sky could show you all the ways I desperately tried to cut wood
Oh
before
God.
I had a saw, before all the ways I tried to adhere wood together, before I
Mm.
had a drill, before I understood about different kinds of screws. Like, I I have had the most fantastically adventurous education into myself as an artist. I have. I'm so grateful. And it's been clunky. It's been clunky and it's been messy. And there were times when I would be scared to death that nobody would ever take me seriously as an artist. Not scared to death, but really have this feeling that I would not ever sort of make it. Because people told me that. People would tell me that in different ways, that you're, you know, that's cute. You're going to be a certain kind of artist. You'll be a certain kind of artist in a certain kind of world. And maybe people will show your work one day. All
But
right.
I think, I went through, studied art in college and got in grad, but I never took any sculpture classes. And so, I too am kind of like, fumbling my way in the dark to try to figure out how things are done. And, I think my first piece of sculpture, CJT Blanc, looks a lot like the 4x5 he started out as. He didn't make it too far. And but what's beautiful about that is I think that sometimes those technologies are a hindrance, and that without knowing how it's supposed to be done, you can just make up and do it however you want. And the
Yeah.
downside of that is things coming unglued, or things kind of like arms dropping off, and you got to get back in there. And especially when it's in someone's collection, you get this phone call. It's like, Allison?
Oh my God, I'm so glad you had phone calls.
We shouldn't be talking about this because ain't nobody gonna want to buy art from us anymore. But
Oh my God. Yes. Oh my, listen, my therapist hardly ever calls me directly, right? So when my phone rings and I see that number, and the first thing I'll say is, did something break?
right, fall apart.
Something break? What's wrong?
We're always happy to fix it. It's an opportunity to go back and visit our babies again. They go out there in the world and we never get to see them again. And it's our chance to kind of like go. It's kind of like, going back and combing your baby's hair one more time, sort of thing, So it kind of has, I know and I think, and even if it changes, I remember, when I worked for my father, who's an art conservator, and a lot of the work I did was for, Iris Silverman and Jan Baum Gallery, who were the first gallery to represent me when I actually got out of school. But they collected, they dealt in African art. And I'd always loved to see the pieces that had been broken and how they were mended, and how these really ingenious ways with little bands of metal that were hammered out and put back together. And I just like, and even, this thought, and I think in a lot of cultures globally, they embrace that break as part of that piece's life, sort of thing. And they embrace that it is, shows evidence of, that piece's suffering and that piece's ability to survive that and to become stronger by surviving that. And so in some way, I like to think that all of those things that go wrong is part of their journey as well. And that just makes them stronger, right?
It does. I really am expanding my understanding of and how I own my life as an artist and what's really happening in that. It's like, sometimes people ask me questions about my practice as though I clock in and clock out of it. As though it's like 12 o'clock, I'm in the studio, 9 o'clock, I'm out of the studio. And I explain to people, I say, no, this is everything. This is all the time. It is the way that I look at the world. It's the way that I look at all the materials in the world, that I look at light in the world. I'm always an artist. I'm always gathering ingredients, and I'm with
like that.
all the stuff that I'm collecting in my studio. And there's something about a mend. There's something about mending, because I came to I came to understand that there was holiness and sacredness in the mending, and seeing how that was done in other cultures, whether it was gold on porcelain, or whether it was the hammered wood on a wooden piece. And there's something about it. So in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, there were all these old steel mills and factories and stuff. And so I used to know an antique dealer who would have these special things in her shop, and she called it mill guy art. She called it mill guy art. And they would be like pieces from a steel mill that somebody took home and they built something with. But there was always so much information for me in the construction and in what was saved to make something new. And I could also look at the work, and I could tell, and I could sort of read the time that it took. I could read time in the work. And then in being able to read time in the work, I could look at it and I could recognize that something happened to that man while he was making that mill guy art, that he was processing through his life and his relationships and his time and any like issues, that it would be inside of that work, that mill guy art, that all of that, it contained all this information. And as I expand into like the depths and I think of it like literally the parallel dimensions of my practice, I recognize that when I get called back to mend something, that when something breaks, that it's happening for more than one reason. It's not just happening so that I can fix the piece. I had to go repair a piece in Fort Lauderdale in January. So I flew out of the frigid January temperatures to Fort Lauderdale. Super tropical, and I was like, well, if this ain't on purpose, I don't know what is. But also that in the mending, I get an opportunity to see a thing with new eyes. I have to look at it in a certain kind of way, and that requires me to center myself, to like leave behind the anxiety that I have that the piece broke it all, and I have to center myself enough to look at the broken pieces and to recognize that it can be fixed, that it might be different. But all of that process to me is holy now. All of it is holy now. I used to suffer it. I really did. I would feel so humiliated, and I would feel heartsick a little bit when somebody would tell me that something broke, and I would be full of apologies. But the thing I say now is, we can fix it.
Yeah, I can fix it. We make it better or whatever, and it's just part of its life, right?
Yeah.
I knew that baby was going to call me to come back and visit, so you can think of it that way. Well, I don't want to scare any folks off, but but it's interesting in terms of what you're talking about, the mending. I think one of my favorite Ray de Carava photographs is a photograph of the back of a man's shirt, and you can barely make out, by the curves up by the shoulder, that's what you're looking at. But there's a tear that went down like along the spine and had been mended back together. And to me, that was just so powerful because, one, he was working hard to tear the shirt, and maybe he didn't have a ton of shirts, he couldn't just toss it away. But two, that whether he mended that himself or someone mended it for him was just this sort of, it just talked about, love and need and making do with what you've got. And it was just like such a powerful piece. And so, I started making these prints and paintings on these old seed sacks, that have been mended, and these, they stay within families for years. And some of them are from the 20s and stuff. And the idea that, and then, or the flour sacks that end up being quilts that get mended over and over again. And then once once they are like totally threadbare, I love it because then it's like this veil that kind of is imbued with this sort of history of, people, babies puking on it, elderly people peeing on it, and then people making love on it in between, sort of thing. And I just love, this idea of the care of mending and taking these materials on. Yeah.
So when you're in the studio, I know this is going to be a kind of general question. What does it feel like when you're making sculpture? What does it feel like? Can you talk us through some of the like sort of secret senses of your material and your subject, like what you're working on? Sort of bring us into that world.
Well, I think the work comes sometimes out from different places. I know sometimes it's you find something and it just tells you what it wants to be part of, or sometimes you find something and you hang on to it for like 10, 15 years and it finally starts like, excuse me, I think I'm ready, sort of thing. So that's one part of the process. Sometimes you hear something, you read something, you hear some music, and literally images just like come. I'm embarrassed that I've gone to many like, concerts, like classical concert sort of things, and I'm just kind of like sitting there, and all of a sudden I gotta like dig my purse out and get a piece of paper and pen, and people are like, what on earth are you doing? And I'm like, I'm sorry, I just got to shut this down real quick, sort of thing. So, sometimes it just comes and kind of hits you, and sometimes things are a real struggle. Sometimes you kind of have this vague idea of what it's supposed to be, but it doesn't really kind of reveal itself to you, and you have to like work through the materials and wrangle stuff, and sometimes you put stuff on and then you take it all off and then put other stuff on. So it really is really varied. And then, there's always those moments, again, kind of the nice thing and not necessarily having folks in the studio and being able to work alone is sometimes you just sit in the studio like for 5 hours looking out the window.
Yeah.
Nothing happens. And maybe nothing is physically happening, but I think, within that sort of time and space, it's a chance to kind of like let go and let loose of all this other stuff that's kind of like banging on your door to kind of like get recognized and allow yourself to kind of find what direction you need to turn to, right? And how about yourself?
You listen, so much of that is true to me. Like, I could be anywhere. I could wait in line for 12 hours and feel fine as long as I have a piece of paper and something to write with, because I love what happens when I let my hand go at the page, that I'm just feeling and breathing, and maybe I'm chatting with somebody and I let my hand go. I like to see what arrives from inside of me. I feel that I have this connection to my ancestors through my DNA, like they're physically in my body. I physically am them. I am. There's 500 years or more of my people that I'm walking around with. And I started to have this discussion with myself in the studio. At a time when it was really hard for me to keep myself alive. It was really hard for me to want to stay alive in the studio, in the world at all. I was like really struggling with how to stay alive. And I started having this discussion with these feelings that I have, because sometimes I would see an object and then see other images with the object, or I would, just let my hand go and write things down. But I started to realize that since I carry my people with me, there must be a way that I can communicate with that information, that I can be in resonance with the communication of my people who are inside of me. And so I have that experience sometimes really viscerally when I'm in the studio, that I'm not alone. And sometimes it really happens when I struggle. Like if I'm struggling in the studio, if I'm on a deadline, which happens now, like before when I was working, I was literally working to save my life. But now my world is like, I have deadlines. I have to make things. People want images, and sometimes that works with how I feel, and sometimes it doesn't. And there are times when I would really fight that feeling that of coming to the studio and just sitting and being and looking out I would fight it, and I would feel, and I would judge myself. I would say, you're lazy, you are, you don't have a good work ethic or something. But now I have more peace with understanding that the studio is always communicating something with me. But I really came into a place where I had to give myself permission, one, to own my own practice, right? To own my own practice. I gave myself permission to be like, I'm in the studio and I write on the walls in my studio. I sketch right onto the walls of my studio. I give myself messages on the walls of the studio. There's a picture of my mother in the studio. There's a photo of Harriet Tubman in my studio. And I had to give myself complete unangsty authority to inhabit that space and to allow the space to speak to me and to be spoken to and to have deep listening in this space that nobody else could affirm from outside. I just had to affirm that in the studio. So there are ways that I work that that are really magical sometimes. Sometimes things happen and I make the work, it goes out into the world. I go to a museum to do an artist talk. I see the work again and I'm like, did I make that?
Yeah.
Where did that come from? And ways that when I sometimes hear other people talk about the work, that I see things and the work comes alive for me in a different way. But one of the things that I had to stop doing in the studio was bringing in anybody else's idea of what it was to be an artist, or what it was to have a practice, or what it was to even to be productive. The idea that I was always supposed to be productive, that my labor has started to mean a lot to people outside of my studio.
They're like, get on it.
Yeah. Oh, man. Listen, I experienced that. I have experienced that external pressure in real ways recently, and it's been painful. That's not an easy thing, to those expectations, but
yeah, well, I don't know if like you, when that pressure starts coming in, these walls start going up, and then it all becomes kind of closed in, and it's really hard to function within that. And
it is.
Sounds like you got it all worked out, but I still beat myself up all the time, like, working in the garden the other day. I'm just like, oh, I should really be in the studio making this thing. And, but that I think, and I kind of go in weird waves. Like I'll, have a deadline. I'll be like freaked out for like 3 months. I'll hit the spot, and then I can just make, and then I'll be, in the studio, like, 6 to 10, in the full day. And then, totally exhausted, laundry's piled up, the studio's just havoc and everything. And then, once the work's out there, then it's just kind of like everything falls away. And then it's really hard for me to kind of get back in there and to kind of understand what the next step is. And then you have these anxieties about, well, maybe the wells run dry sort of thing. And maybe there's nothing else coming down the pipe for us sort of thing. And so it's kind of this ebb and flow, which can make you really crazy. And I keep on, trying to like, pay heed to even the words that you just said, but it's sometimes difficult to do.
Yeah, I remember when we were in New York and you were looking at the show and you said, when did you make all of this?
Yeah, you said you did it all of it.
Like how, and I remember you said, like, how did you work this fast or something? And I said, I work like I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
And that's, because I can feel, sometimes I feel as full as a volcano. Like all these ideas, it's just, I feel them vibrating and stacking up and so eager to get at my hands or to get out of my mouth, that I want to work. I want to work that hard. And also it feels really good to me. It feels really good to me to be submerged in a body of work. even if there is some pressure, I live in the knowing that anything is possible. Sometimes I just start taking different things off the shelves in my studio, and I just start stacking them and moving around and doing things and be like, anything is possible. Anything is possible.
Right.
Possible. And I trust my instincts. I count my instincts as a critical technology in my practice, but it's not that, like, the anxieties that I have are ugly and they're mean to me, and I can be really ugly and mean to myself in my head.
Yeah.
And um, and honestly, the isolation helps that sometimes, to not have other things coming in from outside, because um, it can become, yeah, I just say it, like, it can become an ugly cycle in my head. But for me, it's a lot about worth. It's a lot about value. Like, am I worthy as an artist? Am I making work that is like this? And then I start thinking about, like, what are these critics going to think about? Like, that will happen to me. Like, who's going to talk about the work? Who's going to write about the work? Are they going to say, I had a critic write about my work in Pittsburgh once, and they said it was derivative. And I was like, isn't everything?
Oh yeah. Oh I can top that. Someone said mine was banal. So, and I had to like, I'm like, well, the truth is I've got 2 kids. I've got a minivan. Yeah. Part of my life is really banal. I pick my kids up from school. I take them to school. I do homework with them. That is part of who I am, for real. But,
How, how, how has it been for you? Are you making right now in this time? Have you been making?
And I think that's what's really wonderful about this conversation, because, you get to this point and it's just, you see all of this shit going on out there, and it's kind of like, what place does art have in all of this? Why are we making it? And 2, why are people paying all this money to buy it? And is that even right? Is that somehow screwed up? And, but I mean, the truth is, I think that's the only thing I'm actually really good at. It's the only thing that I'm really able to do. I think I was a waitress for a day, got hired and fired the same day. But, so I'm kind of torn between that. I'm kind of torn between whether this is what we should be doing and all of that. And, I actually personally haven't been able to go out and do much stuff physically in terms of protest and stuff like that, just because, got to kind of maintain a low profile for my mom's health and all of that sort of thing. So, yeah, so it's kind of had me, at one point, feeling a lot of guilt for not being able to be as active as I'd like to be. But also just being really thankful to be able to, work by myself in my own studio and work by myself at home. And, but yeah, the work's kind of slow. I've got like a bunch of stuff that's starting to, pile up that I need to get to. I need to do, there's some public pieces out there that are kind of like, contracts about to be signed sort of thing. And the other day I was in the studio and we were just putting some wood together for a little piece that I promised to somewhere, and got the chainsaw out just to cut a piece of wood in half. And then it was like, oh yeah, the chainsaw, this feels so good. Like, yes, I can do this. I can do it. And now, now it's going to be like 100 degrees in my studio. So we'll see. I'll have to like get up really early to go down there and get the work done before I pass out. But yeah, sometimes, like you said, you're pulling stuff off of the shelves and things like that. I think, cleaning the studio and rearranging stuff, and then all these things again will say, yeah, you're kind of in this real, lull point in your work. We're going to kind of like, pull you up out of that mire and help you get working again. So I think we're fortunate in that respect. I really ponder how poets do it. Well, you're a poet as well. So, but for me, it's kind of like, to have stuff to kind of motivate me is really, I think, great. But I think it'd be really, really challenging to kind of like work with language that's just out there floating. How do you grab that and bring it in? So I'll ask you that. How do you grab that and bring it in?
Oh, wow. You know, sometimes I can uh, I can hear phrases very clearly in my head around certain situations or pictures. I can feel the language come very, very clearly and crisply to me. And to be honest, I write better when I'm on my period for some reason. And like,
It'll encourage a lot of girls out there.
yeah, so like I can feel it coming. Like I can feel the language start to
Mm.
come easily and open and to sort of crack windows as my period starts. And then when I'm on my, like, so if I have to write a speech or something and my period starting to come, I'm like, this is gonna be a good speech. Like this is,
I'm feeling it. The tide's rising.
but I feel, because sometimes people say like, what do you like better? Do you like poems better, or you like photography, or you like sculpture? And I tell them, I say, it's all the same thing. It's a language. It's sometimes maybe it's like code switching sometimes even, but I feel the frequency. Like my studio will start to feel like it's tapping me. Like it's like, come on, you got to come back. You got to come back. And I don't know if you feel this, but sometimes, and that's not something that I've clearly articulated, but I'll feel afraid to go into the studio. I'll feel afraid to start something new because I don't want to let myself down and I don't want to let the work down and I don't want to cheat the work. And I have been very distracted. I've been really distractible lately. And I'm like always, I feel like I have telepathic communication to the work that's in progress in my studio. Like it's always with me. I'm always building it. Even if I'm not physically doing it, I'm always considering it 360 degrees. But I do sometimes have this fear about that starting something new place. And the work works it out through me. And there'll be, if I'm working on a series of things, the first piece in the series will be fucked up. The first piece in the series will be like, it'll be the piece that gets me through the fear. It'll be the piece that sinks me back into the sort of language and the world of the studio. And, you know, I was with my partner at the cemetery last week, or yeah, it was last week, to put some rose quartz on her sister's grave. And this series of events happened at the cemetery, and I could feel the whole time that I was writing that I would have to write about it. And I knew what the first sentence would be. We went to the cemetery today to put rose quartz on your grave. And sometimes there's just a clarity that I have in taking one or two steps back and looking at exactly what is. We went to the cemetery today to put rose quartz on your grave, and we could not find your grave. So I had to call the office at the cemetery, and they sent down a woman who was on her cell phone. She called from the car window and she said, "Oh, you're in the right place." And I just, all of it started to come to me, feel it. But then there are some times when I write to make medicine for myself, because I have had such bad depression, and I have had there's no glamorizing that place where you don't know if you want to be alive anymore. But there are times that has been so hard for me that I had to dig so deep to figure out a way to keep myself alive. And one of the things I understand now is that I have all of this art and all of this way of being in the world that can keep me alive. And I actually used to navigate being in the world. So sometimes I write in a way that I can think of like a pharmacist making a compound to make a medicine. And so I'm writing magically, I'm writing medicinally, I'm writing not just to have a clear understanding of language and an order of words, but I also want to, I put sort of secrets and riddles inside of the feel of the sound of set of words. So I have poems where sometimes I perform a poem and I say, what is that poem about for you? And people say, oh, that poem is about hands and shooting star hands. And I say, well, I wrote that poem to cure my friend from cancer. And I wrote that poem and I put the secret medicine inside the sound of the words making music together. So the medicine is in the feel of the sound, is in the symphony of the sound, and you get to have this roller coaster, experience of hearing me say all these words. And but I believe in magic. Do you believe in magic? Do you have magic? Oh, speak to the magic that you have in your life or in your studio.
Well, before we move on, I mean, I love this idea that, that that you kind of like invest this into the sound, and I love that those poems then kind of transcend language, and it transcends, I mean, that it can be appreciated globally because you don't necessarily have to understand the words. If you just hear it and you get it kind of without all of that, I think that's beautiful.
Oh, yes. And it's like I remember performing them for Chinese people, and they had a translator, but people said afterwards, they were like, it felt so good, like we could feel the poem, just how you performed it. And I was like, this means that a lot to me. But it's
Also, because you said before we went on, before we opened up our conversation, we were yammering on beforehand, and you were saying that you kept on saying things in couplets and rhyming stuff and things like that, and that that I think that that's something that is unfortunately lost in translations, right? In terms of the way words dance with each other, and revolve around each other and caress each other, and that when you start translating things, sometimes that's often it's gone, and you can't I guess a good translator would try to find something that can make a facsimile of that, but still. So
I wanted to say something to you also. I wanted to say, so this space about time and not being in the street and not doing like protesting or something. And what should we be doing right now? And that period of time when I was like barely making it, your work meant so much to me. Like just I'm so glad I don't have to live like that anymore, and I'm glad I don't feel like that anymore. But I know how hard it is to be in the street. It's hard to be in the street over and over again, because like the images that you see of people protesting, that's just like seconds. But I've done protests for 5 hours, 6 hours. Being locked down on a freeway, and it's one of the things that you don't see. One is like what some of the things that have happened to me is like the police mock you. Like you'll be at these protests and it is not just a solid line of riot cops not talking to you. They talk to you. They say things.
Right.
People in are saying you get death threats if you get quoted in the newspaper. I've gotten death threats. I've gotten, it's exhausting in a way that it's energizing, but then it's exhausting. And when you're in a state of exhaustion, how do you go back to the well? How do you fill up the place where you have the energy to go back in the street and have a riot cop pointing or like how when we were at Standing Rock, all those M16s, like all those, they had tanks out there.
Yeah, right.
So in going into the well, and one of the things that I want to tell more people is when you take a break, when you're not in the street, when you're having your downtime, just look at art. Just start following images that feel, and you don't have to think about it. Because I meet so many people who are like, I don't know art world talk. I don't know theory. I don't know language. I say, just look at it.
Right.
Just look and feel, and let your eyes move over an image or move over a sculpture, and then look at another one. Because we are so powerful as human beings, and the act of creating is so powerful. It's so loving. It always makes more of itself. And so I can testify in person to the fact that part of the reason that I'm okay, and that I'm alive today is because honestly, like, I hope that this doesn't sound so crazy fangirlish, but I recognize that even in the line of your family, So it's like looking at Leslie's work and looking at your mother's work. And there is an element in there that is pure language of soul for me. And it kept me going. And you know, one of the ways it kept me going, Alison, is that I just kept wanting to see more. And if I had ended my life, what would Alison Saar make next year that I would miss out? If I had just, no, for real. Like, but I mean, I don't know if one, like, do you recognize how many Black Lives Matter activists have ended their lives or have been killed, or how many young people are ending their own lives? And how one of the gifts that we have from artists is the work. You don't have to know how to talk about the work. If you can look at the work and allow yourself to be with the work and feel the work, and to open up that place, it will gift to you. It will happen. And the thing is, there's a space of trust in it, that just by looking, you'll see something else. And maybe you'll see something on Wikipedia and it'll take you to another place. That's what we need right now. We need our artists to be artists. We don't necessarily need our artists to create to a movement or to create to a moment. I feel like I want to know what is coming out of the artist, like what is yours, what is pure, what is bubbling up from inside of you, what do you have to make? And if you're not making, then I recognize that too, places of quiet are part of the process. But our activists in the street basically every day of the week, like I think about people walking past your Harriet Tubman piece, the public artwork, and I saw that the other day and I was like, thank God that people have this piece to look at. Thank God that as they're going through the day, as it's busy, as all these things are happening, as they're moving through the street, I literally saw it and I was like, what a gift it is that people get to cast their eyes or be in the presence of this. Because I think one of the ways that white supremacy operates is that it operates by shutting down so many parts of our human technology, by saying it's not real, that feeling these things and thinking this way and loving this way and activating your humanity this way, it's not real, it's not valuable, it's not productive, it's not going to make money, it's not going to do these things.
Has no value, right.
Right, but the reality that I have lived and experienced is that I have been okay through your work. I've been okay through Kerry James Marshall's work. I've been okay through Yo-Yo Ma's music. I've been like, that has actually sustained me. And I want that, I hope that people know that there's hope even in the sight of things that are like, when an artist makes something that's difficult to look at, that's a technology that is opening up and is available to us. Like I believe, like, Dad, do you ever feel like a healer? How do you have it? I hope that isn't too weird a question to ask, because so much of the time in your work, I feel like it's something that I'm experiencing is a relationship with a healing modality.
You know, that would be something I would aspire to. I think that's something that is really, and even not even in terms of kind of attempting to kind of go out there and heal others out there, but to just kind of talk about how I feel. And maybe not necessarily, I've been really blessed with not having any really serious illnesses. And, we grew up modest, but we were never really in dire straits or anything. So, I was really fortunate in the way I was brought up. But, whenever there's a hurt, and I know that like I too, when I was really young, had kind of, fits of depression and not really understanding who I was and why I was here and what I was to become. And, those kind of morbid thoughts that you have, especially when you're like 11 and 12 and 13, about you're never going to make it to 20 because you just, can't bear to exist that long. And, and I wasn't even physically suffering any real hardship, but there's just something in you that feels like, there's something pulling you this other way. And it makes me think of, and am I going to be stupid and not remember his name? Oh, dang. Oh, maybe I'll come back to it. African writer who wrote, Shoot. Oh well. I'll have to come back to it.
Things
What?
fall apart.
No, not Things Fall Apart. More contemporary. Ben Okri, and he wrote the name of that book. But it opens up, that the road was once a river, and because the road was once a river, it was always forever hungry. And the story basically being that this was a young boy who was born, and the spirit world didn't want to let him go, and the spirit world kept on trying to take him back. So he, had a really rough time, in his infantship, because they wanted that soul back in the spirit world, sort of thing. And so I think, sometimes as artists, and you asked if I believe in magic and healing, and I definitely do. And I think skeptics roll their eyes when I start talking about this, so sometimes I don't talk about this publicly, because and sometimes people will say, well, do you really believe in this stuff? I'm like, yeah, I do. And it's not about subscribing to one group. It's not about I think that all comes together. I think they're all different facets of the same coin, basically, that it's all all these spirits are all basically the same entity, or different aspects of the same entity, sort of thing. And so I surely believe in all that stuff. And so I make the art really basically to kind of address sort of my own pain and frustration in the world. And if it can then kind of go out there and speak to that to other folks, then I really celebrate that. But I wouldn't want to assume that it has that potency. You know what I mean?
I hear you tiptoeing around it. That's what I hear you. Because I didn't really politically correct, yeah, I believe in it, and it was healing for me. But if it's healing for you, it's healing. Yeah. Right? Healing for you, it's healing. If you experience magic in it, you don't have to explain that to anybody else. I was told, Vanessa, be really careful talking about your spirit or the spiritual aspect of your work, because people will think that you're hyper spiritual. Mm-hmm. And I was like, as though that's a bad thing.
Right? Yeah. What were you saying, politically correct? I'm like, well, when did politically correct become something that's outside of actually just being what you should be, sort of thing, that it's somehow this other thing, that it's somehow I guess if it's not genuine, of course, but anyway, go ahead.
Whenever I do a lot of studio visits when I have a show at a university or something, and I'm in these internships. Can I just really quick, do you do those? Do people cry when they're in yours? Does that happen a lot?
Sometimes.
People cry so much when I do MFA crits with them, and they're not crying sad tears, but I experience people having this. I experience this frustration in some young artists between what's for them and what's for the art world. What's personal. I was at Marshall University in West Virginia after they had the chemical spill from the train, and all the businesses had to shut down because the water was poisoned. And there was an artist, a ceramic artist, who made a bathtub. And they had this whole work. And so we're in their studio, and we just walked past this 6-foot bathtub that has all this work in it. And they're like, oh, don't mind that. That was personal. I had to make that because I was so frustrated about the chemical spill in the water and how they could do this to us. And they were like, well, let's go look at the real work now. And I was like, wait, right. Why isn't this real work? And who told you? Right. Who told you this is not real work? And is that in your head? What are we supposed to do? And I said, and then I experienced that often, where people are like, this is the real thing, and this is what I had to make. This is what was desperate inside of me to be made. And I say, so why isn't this real? And they're like, well, it's personal, or it's spiritual. It's about my grandmother. And and that's where I see tears when I say, all of this is real. Right. All of it is real, but you need to start to ask yourself, what is this other work over here serving? Was this person, did it just serve an assignment? So look at that. But I experienced that. And one of the things I experienced also especially from Black women, especially from young Black women. When I give talks and I talk about the ecosystem of my studio and I talk about human technology and the technology of the soul and feeling my ancestors, I get so many women of color, young Black women, and even older Black women who come up to me and they say, thank you so much. I have felt these things. I have sensed these things. Or I used to make this art this way and they said that it wasn't real. And that has actually sped up the amount of people who come up to me who want to talk about art and spirit, who want to talk about creating with fierce intention for themselves and for their lives, and having, and they sort of ask me for permission to do that. And I'm like, you already have the permission. The fact that it's inside of you and it won't leave you alone, that you have to do this, that you have to move this way, trust that and listen to that. And I think that we can bring our world into balance in a certain way when as people follow that part of their human technology. And yeah, I just talked for a really long time to say that. Alison, would you like to take some questions from the audience right now?
Oh, yeah, I kind of forgot we had an audience. I'm sorry, folks. We just go off.
You do
okay,
have some
yeah.
great questions if we'd want to field some.
Do you want, Alison, do you want to choose some questions? Or do you want, yeah, can you choose some?
I can't. Why don't you just throw some at me, because I don't know how to do that.
Okay, Alison Ayler is going to throw some questions.
Oh, question and answers.
So here's the one. How have other artists around you influenced your work? You mentioned Adrian Piper, who's mostly performance-based. Your work as a whole is also a performance. I think maybe she's talking to Vanessa there. How have your mantras build your perspective and artistic practice?
Alison, take that.
I think one is just about, having, sometimes it's not even the work, my work may be totally different. And I think the artists that have really inspired me are kind of like really far flung from all different kinds of, types of work and things like that. But I think, it's just this sort of encouragement, kind of where we started the conversation, where kind of really anything is possible, and that, you just kind of have to sort of follow your heart. I think, maybe, aside from artists like my mother and Elizabeth Catlett and these really powerful women artists, and I love that Elizabeth Catlett, she was kind of like the one who was just like, dang, she's got these massive things, and like, I can get a chainsaw. I can do that. And, once I got my first chainsaw, I'm like, whoa, this is killer. And, you were talking about how long you took to like hand sign stuff forever. So sometimes it's, just really inspired by the technology. And then, I think also talking about magic, I see, I knew David Hammons when he was first getting started here in Los Angeles, and kind of followed his work forever. And just, what I really love about him and what I hope to learn about him and his work is the ability to kind of like just be open to whatever comes to you, and just to put it out there. And I'm not to make this, don't mean to say that what he's doing is facile in any way, or that but there's an ease and there's a grace and there's a humor and a poignancy, simultaneously humorous and really powerful, that really inspires me. So those would be a couple of artists that, and then of course, folks like yourself, Vanessa, that, this pickup of materials and just this, I don't know, I just really respect the way that you're out there doing so much, and that you kind of allow yourself to kind of explore, so many different venues to kind of create your work, and your creativity is really inspiring as well. So
thank you. Thank you so much. That's an honor to hear, Alison. Thank you. I have to say, Elizabeth Catlett also. Did you meet her? Did you know her?
Yeah, because, Samela Lewis was my mentor at Scripps College, and she introduced me to all of these amazing people. And it was just like, Well, because, you know, she was really the first one kind of to be out there talking about African American artists, contemporary African American art. And then, you know, it was really beautiful is that she was also inclusive of self-taught artists. She didn't make those those sort of didn't draw those lines as to what was and what wasn't art. And, you know, and her being an African African art historian and, you know, Chinese art historian, and then just an amazing artist in her own right. And I don't know, she kind of blows me away just in terms of how she's been so many things to so many people. So
I remember I was at the Driscoll Center for the opening of African American art 1950 to present, and I got to go into their vault. And this is the first time I ever had that experience. Somebody keys all these numbers into the door and this wall opens. It's basically like this wall-sized space. And we went in and there was one of Elizabeth Catlett's heads just sitting on the table in art storage. And it was so much bigger than I
imagined, right? Yeah.
The scale of it. And the power that vibrated and emanated from it was, I was silenced by it. I remember going in there being silenced by that. And I had met her one time. Women of Vision brought her into Pittsburgh, and they told us when we met her and we had lunch with her, they asked us all not to touch her hands. And that stood out to me. And she was in a wheelchair, and I didn't realize, you know, from pictures how impressive she was, I
always vision her being 6 feet tall. I don't know how tall she was, but she had a real presence. Yeah.
That's like, she was this impressive presence, and she had so much music with her. There was so much jazz around her. There was so much music around her. And I had, and they said, like, when you meet her and talk to her, don't touch her hands. And after I saw that artwork in David Driscoll in the storage at the Driscoll Center, I understood in a different way why they said, don't touch her hands. And it made me think a lot about clearly what her hands had been through and what they had done. And I wrote a poem called If My Hands Were Anything Other Than Hands. And I could see that her hands had made all these worlds, and they're just still so alive. But also, she had a fierceness. I would watch her talks. I would listen to, go back and listen to these words, and she had a fierceness and a clarity that at one point in my life, actually reminded me of Octavia Butler a little bit. Just this way of being so dedicated and focused on the work, and also not suffering fools and not suffering like flimsiness. That was a certain kind of woman. But when I was a kid, my mother would hang out with women like that. And I knew I was too much a girl to be in a circle with women like that. Other artists, what piece, something moved me, and I talked to you about this in LA, was your mom's Biddy Mason piece down in LA. Brought me to tears. It brought me to tears to see that this is a woman who, just that through your mom's body and work and that material, I found out about this human being who would have otherwise been hidden and away from my understanding of who Black women have been in history and could be, that she freed herself, that she gave birth to, that she birthed so many babies, that she's responsible for Los Angeles, for just part of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
I remember just walking around downtown, like, I think we had seen Jill's face, like we had walked around from there, and then I was like, what is this? And I was like, I recognize this is Betty Saar's work. This guy,
she must have called you, because I think that is the lost, it's like
signature.
So that's the most hidden piece of art, So that piece called you to find it, because I go downtown and I'm like, isn't it around this corner? And it's like a maze. It's impossible. It's like in a park, off of a parking lot behind a building, and you really have to seek it out. But that's amazing that she beckoned you to kind of discover her.
And I cried. I was standing there.
Oh, wow.
I grew up in LA. I grew up in LA, Allison, thinking that I was nothing. I grew up thinking that I was like the bare dirt without grass on it. I grew up in LA thinking that I was never supposed to be nappy, that you know, that brilliant Black women were rare.
Yeah.
Because we weren't telling the stories. We didn't see the images. I didn't see myself. Nobody was saying you're gonna be good, you're gonna make it, you're gonna be beautiful, until it was actually Black trans women. It was Black trans women in LA during the AIDS crisis. Look at me with those big hands with Lee press-on nails. They would look at my face and look at my eyes when, you know, only my mother was like, "You pretty, Vanessa." You're so pretty, Vanessa. But, and so when I saw that piece and there's that image of her, and I feel like I look like her. I feel like that. And seeing that work meant so much to me. And also, you know, another work of art that meant a lot to me as a young person was seeing the terracotta soldiers, seeing images of the terracotta soldiers in China, and having my mind blown and being like, human beings made this? And how long has it been buried in the ground?
Yeah, it's crazy.
How fast is it? All the faces are different. How many different faces? They made horses. Like that third grader seeing that and seeing that human beings did that, that added to that added to the growing volume of what it was possible for human beings to do.
For real.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I think also for me, I mean, we actually just got to see those in person. We were in China in December, and it was just like, what? It's just really phenomenal. But, you know, and I think I had the same response, and that was probably maybe my first memory of seeing a work of art was the Watts Towers and seeing.
Oh my God, yes!
You know,
I have to tell you, because it was a field trip that we went on. It was a field trip that we went on in LA, and I remember going to see the Watt. Oh my God, thank you so much for saying that. I'm so moved by.
They're so incredible. And that he just was up there tying pieces of wire. And, you know, I mean, that comes back to this sort of like seeking out those materials and dragging them back and just letting them sit until they tell you where they need to go, sort of thing. But such a magical environment and space, and such a testimony to be able to just make something out of nothing, you know, and just, you know, and also to the testimony of labor to kind of just create things that don't necessarily have, you know, a place in the market or anything, you know. It's like, why are you making this? He says, I just need to make this. And I think that
isn't the question different now as an artist? Like, man, I had a work in my last show in New York. They were like, we don't know.
Like, what is this?
Like, it was everywhere. It was a lot of people come in the room being like,
is that your snake one?
It was snake. It was snake piece. It was that piece. And it was like a whole bunch of mouths doing this. And they were like, we can't actually get it out the building. It's too big. It's too big to get it out the building. I said,
oh, because you made it up to the Bronx.
Yeah, out the Bronx. And I was like, I'll get it. I'll get it out the Bronx. I'll get it. I found two guys in a truck on Craigslist or something. And we got that piece down into Manhattan, into the meatpacking district. But there was one time when they was just like, well, I guess I hope it felt good to make that piece, Vanessa.
But those are the ones, I mean, you even talked about, you know, here we are going off on our own thing again, but, you know, those kind of initial pieces where you don't know who they are or what they're about, and you make it and then you kind of put it aside and then get on with the other stuff. I'm really curious about those pieces and who they become. And I've got a piece that I call my monster that's basically a flayed figure chewing on a chair. And when we actually put it in the show, we tucked her back in the corner. And she's living in this corner now because she's just like, you know, she's just this darkness that is really hard, but, you know, we needed to put them out there. And That'd actually be a really interesting exhibition. We got to get that together of all of our dark, scary stuff that even we don't understand. To kind of put them out there and let them kind of like have their say, because they needed to be made for some reason.
I feel that, and I feel like the time is right for that. Are you suggesting that we do that exhibition now, Allison? Are you?
We should. Just kidding.
Because yeah, when we talked about the snake piece before, I remember you said you got a closet of stuff. You did a closet of things that are dark and scary, and I remember somebody else's work who means a lot to me, and a human being who probably means more to me than they know, because I'm not trying to scare people with how much I love them and shit. It was Renee Stout, Renee Stout,
Right.
who lived in Homewood. And I was feeling myself, making stuff in my little room, gluing stuff together, doing stuff. And I asked her to look at some of my work, and she looked at it, and she looked at me, and she said, some women are afraid to make things that aren't pretty. Don't be afraid.
That's powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, and and that sort of freed me from the pain of thinking that I needed to always be pleasing and romantic in my creating images of Black people, that I had to be like, have that. Have you ever been to a Hallmark store and seen the Black angels that they sell?
Oh yeah, like kind of like
Whimsical, cherubic Black angels, or a Black couple getting engaged. And I remember thinking, is this what I'm supposed to make? Is this what Black art is? Is this what's going to make Black people, help make Black people feel better? And it was Renee saying, don't be afraid. And so that's something that actually comes back around to me, because sometimes I have fear in the studio around, like, especially with something like the snake piece, especially with something where, you know, one, there's text in it, but it's really not pointing to the greatest parts of humanity. And I find that people definitely want me to make them feel good about humanity.
everything
And
has to be positive and uplifting. And
yeah, why don't you give us something positive? And I was like, the truth is positive. You need to decide what you're going to do with it after that. I can't tell you how to make meaning of it, but I want to live in a world where we're safe to express these things, and that where we have guidance and the capacity to know how to make meaning of them and with them. I don't need to try to shut you down because you're sharing that. That's the world that I want to live in. It is Allison.
we're like 2 hours past our.
I know, Lord. Oh, what is it? It's all the time. So let's take some more questions, and then we will say fairly well, and I'll tell some people about some other artists that we're going to talk to next. But let's just take some questions now. Let's roll through some questions. Allison Ayler, you ready?
Yeah, I have a really good one for you, Vanessa. This is from Maddie, Allison's daughter.
Hi, Maddie. I think about you after hearing stories, and I'm excited for the work you're doing in your garden.
She said, I teach a poetry class to a group of artists with developmental disabilities, and often their writings are about their trauma. I see them using spoken and written word to work through these ideas of trauma of the body and mind. Can you talk a little bit about your healing process of writing, and or do you have any writers or writing exercises you can suggest to encourage that healing process?
Yes. So first thing I have to say, Maddie, is that as a human being who is instructing and guiding people who have a pain and trauma through a process, there's a place in that, Maddie, where you should recognize the power that you have. And it's a power centered in loving, in a kind of powerful loving that you have in guiding people into their own health. So you're in that position for a reason, and they are lucky to have you, because there are so many people that, like, I meet a lot of people at writing workshops, and I'll meet people who are like 60, 65 years old who are finally getting to tell their stories, who are finally getting to write things. Some people don't have a you. Some people don't have a Maddie before then. So first, thank you for that work. It's a loving work, and it's a powerful work. And so I have written a lot about trauma that I have experienced, especially because I have witnessed several murders. I have had to, sometimes I just have to write exactly what happened about a thing. And so there are different ways to write, but thinking about writing through trauma to healing specifically, as opposed to just, declaring and saying what happened in a traumatic incident during a life. One of the things I do is magical thinking in writing, and I write roots, I write spells, I write these magic spells. And so there's a task, there's an exercise that you can take some participants through where you ask them, you can decide as a facilitator what sort of category of words and language you want to work with. So I'll ask a group of students, I'll say, give me 3 to 5 words that are, when you hear them, when you experience these words, you feel love. And they can be words or phrases. So when I do with kids, sometimes kids will write down mommy, or they'll write down mashed potatoes and gravy. That's my favorite food. And so I say 3 to 5 words that make you feel love, 3 to 5 words that make you feel like dancing, 3 to 5 words that make you feel hopeful, 3 to 5 words that if you could say them, they would make you feel like you could fly. And what I do is I guide people into creating their own lexicon of love and power and magic. And then I will task them with using those words sort of musically and symphonically in a way that fulfills the following statement. So if they're writing about trauma, and that's something that we're doing, or even if we're not doing it explicitly, I'll say, if you could write a poem that had the power to do anything, what would you want it to do? Because I get the participants to start thinking about what is the actual power of this creativity? And if you could direct it, if you could cast it, if you could move it deliberately, what would you want it to be? So that's the question that I'll ask at the beginning of the writing prompt. If you could make a poem, if you could make a work of art that had the power to do anything, what would you want it to do? If you could write a poem that had the power to do anything for your life, what would you want it to do? And then they'll have that lexicon of great words and phrases. And then I will say, so use these words and these phrases, these words of love, these words of hope, these words that make you feel like you can fly inside of the work of, like, you could make a poem that had the power to do this thing. And because I'm a spoken word artist and it's something that I do, I'll share some poem with them. I'll say, if my hands were anything other than hands, they would be 2 shooting stars, galloping light across the galaxy, a twin fandango of diamond-studded fingerprints, hopscotching a radiant neon merengue of light. And I'll start reading a poem. And I'll say, so you can't understand every word that I'm saying, but it feels like something. So make something that feels like the power that you want to bring about. So one of the things that you can do is you can actually task people and give them the opportunity to write into the future of themselves. Through that task, they can make a medicine with it. And that's something where you can start where you are and say, where are we going? Where's this power going to take us? I hope that helps, and I can talk to you about it more another time if you want to, because it's something that, because I have the art house in Homewood, and we all, some of the kids and I, we've seen the same murders. I've had to talk to kids and talk through really painful things to another place. And sometimes also what I will say is it's not perfect. It can be messy, and it can be hard, and it can ask more of your heart than of your intellectual teacher mind. You have to be present with your loving and with your heart and with your soul, because it's such human work to guide people into writing their own stories and then also writing into their future. Thanks for that question, Maddie. Let's have another question, Allison. Ella.
Vanessa, how about we do one more question and then you talk about talks coming.
Okay.
So how about, this is from the Snipe Museum, someone at the Snipe Museum. They wondered, has the times we live in changed the way in which you think audiences should be engaging with your work?
Alison Saar, you answer that first.
No, you answer it first.
Okay. All right. So, do the times we live in change the way I think people should engage with the work? Is that a good paraphrase, Alison Ayler?
Yes.
No, that's sort of hard for me because you know who I want to really change the way they engage with the work of Black, queer, Indigenous artists of different abilities and disabilities. All of that is actually institutions. So I think I'm ready for the institutions to really excavate all of the bullshit and the shards of white supremacy, racism, and all of those ways that people don't feel welcome in their spaces, to find those out and make sure. So if anything, this time I want institutions to look at themselves as community citizens and to look and to sort of go beyond the work of the intellect into the place of human technology and say, think about how that institution can really raise the frequency and add to the lives, to the quality of the lives of all the people who live around. So it's really important to me that institutions don't make obstacles to people seeing the work and experiencing the work and having a varied experience with the work. Like when my show, when I Come to Do Violence was at the Matrix, people would cry so much in the room that they started to just leave tissue at the judges. And there was one time my sister came to me, she's like, Vanessa, a man has been in there for so long and he's crying and this is happening. And I was like, that's his experience. He's fine. He's not hurting anything. And I love when institutions really make it possible for as many people to have whole human experiences in the spaces as possible. And to me, this time is really an opportunity for institutions to level up and to move forward with courage and to think and to ask themselves, like, how can we be a courageous institution? How can we be an actual loving institution? Should institutions be loving? Because a loving institution, like, what does that mean? I'm ready for institutions to start having different kinds of conversations because of the times that we're living in. And human beings are already having, like, human beings on street level are having those experiences, but some of them need to be given permission into those experiences. Because Alison Saar, I don't know if you've had this experience before where you've been in a museum around your work, and this happens to me like in Detroit, or like this happened to me in Michigan, where I had a young Black man who might have been like 25 to 28 years old come up to me with his mom, and he was sort of crying, and his mom was rubbing his back saying, go on, Rodney, ask her the question. And he says to me, he says, I've never been in this museum before. I really am feeling something around your work, but I don't know how to talk about it. He said, I don't know art words. I don't know art words. So I don't know how to talk to you about it. And he started to cry. And he just, like, his voice broke up, and he was like, I want to be able to talk to you about this. And I was like, and I told him, I was like, well, we are talking, and wherever we are with it is right. Where we are. And I want people to have wherever we are with it is where we are. Experiences, and they can have a spectrum of experiences, but I want institutions to not be afraid of people who feel inside of the museum.
Well, I think even along those, and I think people are always kind of questioning, how do we get the docents to really understand this work? And there's always kind of, they're always kind of referring back to, I think, criticism about the work, which sometimes is just so off the mark. And so just not, and, and I'm saying, well, really what you should be doing is having the docents meet up with the guards and just have the guards tell them what the work is about. Because I think a lot of times the guards are there and they're witnessing what you just, they see these people come in, they see these people respond, they see how children respond, and, to kind of really understand maybe how these viewers are experiencing these works without being told how to experience them. And that it's sometimes so much truer and so much more powerful. And, sometimes you just need to let them go in and, it's like you said, you don't need the language. I'm not going to tell you what to think. Whatever your experience or your response to the work is genuine and is true to the work. And you need to kind of like just believe and understand in that first, sort of thing. So
yeah. I'll just say, like, I value scholarship. I value people who are taking the deep dive and following the light of their research. I have been gifted so richly from Black academics who have opened up worlds to me that have been hidden and submerged through history. So this is not an either or about
right,
that.
yeah.
Definitely expanding the space, as expansive as a community is. And I remember my show was at the Flint Institute of Art, and they started going through their history, and they found and revealing it to their community about how the institution had intentionally raised the price of the museum entrance so high to keep quote unquote undesirable people out, right? And so undoing that, and I think institutions also need to work on repair. Some institutions really need to say, we've been the most welcoming space, and these are the things we're going to do better. How can we do better? And to say, I think that they have to be I think there's an opportunity to build new bridges of strength in the communities around museums and institutions, and being transparent about the ways that you have been exclusive and violent and held violence. Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you, dear. So exciting.
I could talk to you for a long time.
We have spoken for a long time, but we just have to get it some more. We can do this just with ourselves, but that'd be great.
Yeah. I look forward to that. I'll walk you through the garden live.
Okay.
Maybe we can do that, and you can experience sunrise in the garden as I experience it, and not just as a recording. I would love to do that. Thank you, everyone who joined us. Thank you for your questions. I'll look through the questions and maybe answer them on my Instagram if some of them are for me. I'll maybe do a video of some of the questions if I'm able to trap them on the screen. So thank you, everybody who joined us. Thank you, Alison, for making this possible. Alison Ayler for saying yes to the opportunity. Thank you again, everyone who joined the conversation. And there's going to be more conversations. So some of the people we have coming up are Nona Faustine Simmons, who, if you're not hip to her, she is a radical Black woman artist who has created a great, her body of work is, she's becoming a legend. So Nona will be on. My cousins are going to be on.
Cute.
I just talk with my cousins. My cousin Crystal McCreary, who is an actress and an artist, and we'll also talk about the healing arts, specifically talking about the healing arts in art. My cousin Kelly McCreary, who's also an actress. Really excited that Rose Simpson is going to be with us, Indigenous artist. We're gonna have some curators in conversation. I'm really excited to talk to some of the Black curators that I'll be in conversation with. So check out my Instagram and check out my Facebook to find out. We're gonna be having another talk next week. Next week we'll be in artist conversation with my cousin Kelly McCreary, who is an actress and an activist, public school educated, and is deeply beautiful and wise, and one of those women that you wouldn't want to be a flake around, yo. So we'll be in conversation with Kelly next week, and keep a lookout for who's coming up. I send everybody forward with the nuggets of love and wisdom from our conversation. And some of them for me have been hearing Alison Saar talk about the sort of blessing and the privilege of isolation. And it was a real blessing and a privilege for me to be affirmed in some of those places. I want to send everybody forth with the truth that you can make your own ecosystem for creating. It can be what you want, what you need. So that's my nugget. What are your last words, Allison?
Oh gosh, I feel like I've said too much already, but just really appreciate your openness and your sincerity and your power. And, you know, I guess before we had this conversation, you said, well, is there any taboo things? And I said, I just wanted to talk about, you know, we've been through so much darkness that I really wanted to talk about uplifting and, you know, positive things, which doesn't mean that they can't have talk about serious issues, but something that points towards a better place. And so I appreciate that in your work, and just appreciate you, love. So wonderful.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you both. We'll send the link out to everyone so that you can have the recording. We've had lots of questions about that, so it'll be pushed out on Concept social media.
Love you. And both
Fantastic.
Allisons.
Bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye, Allison.
Bye.
Everyone.